Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 5 of the Articulating Insight podcast, the podcast where I talk to interesting and creative people from around the internet about the foundational principles of art, using mainly film and music as our reference points. Although in this episode we got some other mediums as well, so we're really branching out here. So on this episode, I have William Duryea on the podcast, who is the creator of the website Misery Tourism, which publishes various forms of writing and other multimedia art, including independent tabletop games, which is Duryea's own background, which we talk about a bit this episode. And I highly recommend you check out Misery Tourism. There are so many cool artists being represented on there. They have every Friday they have a little live stream called Misery Loves Company, where they have some of their creators that they kind of showcase come on and read their own work, and it's a really great way to connect with these artists in a more immediate way, and it's really just a great experience. So I highly recommend you check out the website and all their social medias to keep up to date with all the crazy shit they do, because they do crazy stuff all the time. But yeah, specifically in this episode, me and Duryea, we talk about the consideration of video games and other interactive mediums as an art form. We discuss about how comedy and sexuality are some of the most primal human responses when engaging with a work of art, and how those can be utilized both positively and negatively, and how cultural reactions to that can reflect on how a culture is directing its media. We also discuss about getting started as a more outsider artist and how to stay motivated against both personal and external restrictions, and how those can actually help manifest creativity. We also get from Duryea a beautiful goddamn defense of abstract impressionist art that is amazing. Like, I almost undersell it in my response, but this was, like, when I was editing, I was just like, this guy is so on it. Like, he just has an amazing justification for what abstract impressionist art and really like any sort of like minimalist kind of creations can achieve, and why it's so valuable that the artists working in these registers are being represented. And finally, we also talk about why the internet age and the kind of rise of this interconnected global community is really important for the rise of outsider voices and for intellectual or creative types everywhere. So yeah, overall, I think this is a really exceptional episode. Duryea is an amazing guest. We have some great conversations about so many different topics. We go so many different places, and he's always has such an impassioned and enlightened perspective, and he's so goddamn articulate. My God. And I feel bad because I can tell, like, just re-listening to the footage, I'm a little off my groove this episode. I won't lie. I'm not being near as cogent as I would like to be, and I just kind of whacked out. And that's not helped by the fact that I had my mic set up in a really stupid way, and it was so dumb because looking back, I was trying to set up my mic so it would minimize any sort of noise, because I noticed a few clicks in the past, and instead I just made it 100 times worse. So I'm so sorry. I really tried to fix it as best as I can, but I'm not an audio wizard at all. So yeah, I'm sure a lot of it comes through. I'm so sorry if you hear bumps or mic like little scratches and stuff. That's totally my fault. I apologize. But the episode's still listenable. You can still hear Duryea just go the fuck off on so many great topics. So I highly recommend sticking it out, even though audio quality is not the best, and that's totally my fault. And I've taken steps to prevent this happening again in any future recordings. So, you know, starting out a podcast, we're learning. We're learning together here. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. I feel like I've already said too much about this episode, because, I mean, just go along for the ride, and I really hope you guys enjoy my conversation with William Duryea.
Misery Tourism, which is the website that I'm the editor-in-chief of,
Yeah.
started out as a indie kind of tabletop RPG site. My friend Rudy and I, Rudy being the other co-founder of Misery Tourism, we got really deep into the like narrative indie RPG community, and we quickly discovered that this was back in 2011, 2012. We quickly discovered that, like, if you're making homebrew RPGs, they're like two distinct groups, right? They're like two factions, and one of those factions is like hyper traditional. Like, they're not just trying to make a more technically complex version of Dungeons and Dragons, but they're trying to make a more technically complex version of like second edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, right?
Yeah.
Like they're deep. Like if you're talking about internet subcultures or social media subcultures, they'd be like the trads,
Yeah.
which is to say that they're like so deeply ingrained in this like particular, like highly puritanical, very crunchy mechanical perspective on how RPGs should be, and they just want to make really obnoxious like strategy games
Yeah.
basically with the same kind of like high fantasy settings that you'd find in Dungeons and Dragons or most RPGs.
Hmm.
And obviously like Rudy and I just did not we can't like we were playing making games with like musical chairs mechanics and other like crazy shit like that. Like I think Rudy had one at the time where like the mechanic was basically Pictionary, and these guys were like, "Well, that's not an RPG," you know. That like you guys are way too fucking out there. This is just silly shit. This isn't real RPG shit. And then the other faction, if we're going by like social media like cliques of today would have been like the woke faction.
Mm.
And these were the story games guys, and they were totally 100% down with doing weird mechanical shit, having hyper minimalistic mechanics, or having mechanics that are stolen from other games, or having mechanics that are weird and subversive or whatever. But what they were not at all down with was the content of our games. They were not at all down with games that set out to
Like transgressive games, though. Like,
yeah, they were not at all. Yeah, that's the perfect way to put it. They were not at all down with transgressive games, and a lot
Mm.
of the games that Rudy and I made were not like strictly like quote unquote like edgelord games, but they were games that would take like serious and sometimes disturbing like sociological shit, right?
Hmm.
Like I made a game that was like a deconstruction of like the lynch mob, Jim Crow kind of mentality and things
Mm.
like that. And these were games that tried to grapple with these issues in a way that I think in sometimes the idea often was to have the player not leave the game feeling clean and innocent. Like I think a lot of times there's this perspective where, well, if you're going to design a game and it's going to grapple with like serious sociological subject matter,
Hmm.
well, then the game better be very clear about the moral stance it's taking, better be unequivocal in terms of like from like a quote unquote safety perspective, unequivocal about making sure that the players have exactly the experience they're supposed to have, and
Hmm.
being unequivocal about like debriefing the players, like letting the players know that obvious shit like racism is bad. It's like, well, okay. No, like a very like heavy-handed didactic stuff that's
Hmm.
supposed to keep players feeling safe throughout the course of the game, and supposed to leave them feeling unequivocal and unambiguous about what the message of the game was. Whereas with Rudy, what Rudy and I were doing, it was more like we want players to be forced to occupy the psychology of like people of people who were like either troubled or fucking evil, right?
Hmm. Yeah.
We want you to occupy like what is it like? What was the psychology of like a southern racist who would participate in a lynch mob? Because it's easy, like there's this kind of cultural consensus. It's very easy to look at that and say it's bad.
Yeah.
It's harder to look at that and try to get in deep and understand like what's the psychology that underlies moral panic,
Hmm.
and is that like is there actually some of that like operating that you like the player who want to preserve a kind of safe distance between yourself and this phenomenon that you actually carry around with you from day to day? Could you just as easily slip into this kind of like moral panic, lynch mob mentality about something else?
Yeah.
And so it was very much about trying to get the players to occupy that uncomfortable space and to leave it feeling like not good about themselves and not good about like the unequivocal like moral simplicity of the universe, but like deeply disturbed by the moral ambiguity of the universe,
Yeah.
and deeply disturbed by maybe their own capacity for evil, if you want to call it that, or their own capacity for depravity or whatever. And there just was no base in either of those communities for that kind of work. And so
Yeah.
we created Misery Tourism as a way to share that kind of work and have a space for work that was willing to transgress like not only like moral and ethical perceptions of what gaming can and should be, but also technical ones,
Hmm.
mechanical ones.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, I feel like I'm sorry, I've kind of been droning on about
No,
this, but
no,
that was kind
that's
of
awesome. No, that's so good. I have two like points I
yeah,
really, really want to make, and they both relate to that. So the first part was that you talking about like the two factions of people. I literally experienced that exact same thing in anime music videos, which was a scene I was obsessed with and like deeply entrenched in from 2018, probably until about this year. Where I made these like really esoteric like videos with using like trying to explore like the pedophilic notions of like otaku subculture, the inherent kind of loneliness and weird like ties to how religious iconography has almost been superseded by like waifus and stuff like that, and how the
oh
same way
wow.
people wanted to like it's like an icon that gives you purpose and identification, and it's weird how it's shifted now into this kind of hypersexualized form of that or anything. So I was trying to use the medium to explore those things, and so of course there's the two camps of like people who just want anime music videos that are fun, flashy,
Mhm.
silly, and like like appeal to their preconceptions of what both the anime they're dealing with is, what the culture they're existing in, like all the stuff you said about like the trads, like they like the medium for escapism, and they'll work heavily within those machinations, like you said, like with the highly technical Dungeons and Dragons, like basically clones at that point, and like the AMVs that win the top awards at like the big anime music video contests, they're all just more technically advanced versions on like the classic pleasing animes and anime music video styles. And then there's a very small sect, like I could probably count the number of people who exist in this on like two hands, of people who are interested in the medium for Stranger Things, for not the show Stranger Things, but for stranger
Yeah,
concepts,
sure.
like actual modes of articulation. And I think the parallels we see in both of those, in both tabletop games and anime music videos, both happen because they're mediums that have been kind of sidelined by both art scenes and mainstream cultures in a weird way. So they exist in this weird niche, so they haven't had the chance to develop into like like film or painting or whatever, like these
Sure,
big
sure.
mediums have had a chance because the conscious people, less of them are drawn there just because the niche is smaller. Maybe, I don't know,
Yeah,
that
no, I
might be
think
wrong.
that's absolutely the case, and I think in both cases you're also looking at relatively new art forms, right?
Yeah.
And you're looking at like relatively, I mean, I guess in some ways RPGs are actually older than video games,
Mhm.
but there's been a lot less money
Yeah.
put into that zone, right? And there's a lot less. It's a much, as you said, like nicher, smaller crowd that you're dealing with. But I think in both of those cases, you're talking about like nascent art forms,
Yeah.
and I think unfortunately, because you're dealing with nascent art forms that have come about, that have really started to come in their own in the internet era, they're kind of their development has been like subject to the like quirks and manias of the internet
Hmm.
era, excuse me,
Yeah.
of the social media era. Um, like if film was like just created in like in the 1980s or 90s, right?
Hmm.
And only became a thing that began to be shared through the internet, and there was only really an artistic community around film only started to develop in tandem, excuse me, with the development of social media.
Hmm.
I think I don't think you'd see like you know new wave films or the auteur films of the 70s in the US. I don't think you would see Scorsese,
Yeah.
and I don't think you would see Francis Ford Coppola, and I don't think you would see like Bergman or any of the like, because I think those things are in some ways subject to the time that they developed in, to the communities that they developed in, to the resources that were available, and most importantly, like to the social pressures of the
Yeah.
time. And I think right now, unfortunately, like the larger prevailing like cultural pressures and social pressures are dragging people towards a kind of polarization,
Yeah.
polarization that goes beyond simply being political to being like cultural and intellectual. And I don't think there are many bases right now, unfortunately, for work that wants to be kind of, as I said before, transgressive in both content and tone, or in terms of both content and technique,
Hmm.
like to really blossom and to really find an audience. And I think that's really unfortunate, because I think those alternative modes, like the approaches that are in vogue right now to fit for film criticism, for criticism of like any variety,
Hmm.
are really stilted, really limited, and mostly lead people towards a joyless approach to like looking at art, you know?
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. Like,
sorry, but you had another thing that you wanted to talk
yeah,
about.
it's I think what you said was so great there. And I also think in addition to that, you're talking about like more great works have the opportunity to be created because of like the wider cultural acceptance and like the greater time to develop for those mediums. And I think also a big part is just the recognition of a cultural canon and like a wider recognition of works in those mediums, because I've seen anime music videos that like could be like a the equivalent of a Scorsese or a like a Francis Ford Coppola or something if the medium was taken seriously. But it's like it's not. So like it's not that those works aren't being necessarily created. It's that those works aren't being recognized and championed, and thus those people don't have the opportunity or the resources to make more. And so I think it's like a tandem thing there.
That is, I 100% agree with you there, and I think that's, to kind of bring it back to what I was saying about misery tourism.
Hmm.
That's a lot of what like we are trying to do. A couple of years ago, we really expanded our sphere of content beyond games to include, art and music and literature, and especially literature. I think for whatever reason, literature has increasingly become a focus in terms of the content that both the content that's submitted to us and the content we ultimately end up publishing. And but yeah, I agree with you. There is absolutely no shortage in games, in music, in film,
Hmm.
in any of these genres, in any of these mediums, in terms of content, in terms of art that is legitimately, kind of trying to accomplish the goals that we're talking about.
Hmm.
The problem is, as you said, it's 100% resources. It's 100% what's the larger cultural narrative about, where's the money at,
Yeah.
where does the advertising revenue go, all of these things.
Hmm.
And what do the institutions, whether we're talking about the big five publishing companies in literature, whether we're talking about the few remaining major, film conglomerates, if you're talking about movies, the major record labels, so on and so forth. Like, where are they putting their resources? Where are they putting their attention? In all these cases, it's very clearly like either in mass media, Marvel-esque popcorn shit, or it's in, playing one side or the other of the culture war in order to get engagement through resentment. And I think in both cases, like work that wants to be artistically challenging is kind of SOL, you know?
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. And I think specifically, like what I wanted to mention about games earlier is I think games are like a real double-edged sword, which is why I think even like I don't know, in this say, um, like I'll speak specifically to video games. That's something I'm more familiar with, but you can absolutely talk about tabletop games too. And I've been feeling there's a lot of overlap, in the sense that these things are like on a large scale, require a lot of resources. Like games, I would think the
Yeah.
effort to make a truly like AAA game is much more than a film or whatever. Like a film, because I mean, I know like the Avengers budgets, they're so inflated and stuff, and it's not necessary. But you can make a film that looks like the Avengers on a much smaller budget than like the base level of to make a game. I would think.
Oh,
Um,
absolutely,
yeah,
absolutely.
and but then I think what I wanted to mention about the medium earlier is I think interactivity poses a lot of contradictions to how we view art. Like, I
Yeah.
mean, the name of the podcast is Articulating Insight because that's what I want to try to establish a definition for art is, as kind of counterproductive as that may be, is that film is the preservation of personal insights you gain throughout your life that other people can draw on, and like those can manifest in like an infinity of ways. But it's still you're preserving a singular or in some ways collaborative, but still like a perspective. And with games, you now have to account for everyone else's perspective as well
Sure.
in the preservation of your perspective. So in that way, it almost becomes a medium of like curation or something rather than a direct like what we would consider an art form up to this point. So I was thinking what you were saying earlier about putting yourself in the head of the mom mentality to gain an understanding of that. I was thinking a game that I thought did that effectively was like one of the biggest things that stopped me from thinking that games weren't art under this new definition was something like Papers, Please. I don't know if you ever played that indie
Yeah.
game.
Yeah, I have.
Yeah, and I thought like I mean it's not the most ambitious game. It just wants to do one thing, which is to put you in the head of someone who has to make these bureaucratic decisions on the day to day on the individual level, and justify feeding your family with this in-game currency versus helping people who are in need.
Yeah, absolutely. And I so I played the first couple of hours of Papers, Please, and I
Mhm,
understand like that it kind after that it kind of evolves into something a little different.
mhm.
But I was actually really impressed with the degree to which the first few hours anyway were really entrenched in like the bureaucratic mundanity,
Mhm.
of of this life and the idea of making small shitty decisions that potentially have like profound consequences,
Yeah.
right? And I think I agree with you. Like what you just articulated was kind of Ebert's argument for
Yeah.
why games weren't art, right? The idea that art exists as a means to share a very particular, carefully curated, carefully assembled perspective,
Mhm.
and that interactivity drips something away from there, right?
Mhm.
That interactivity, the ability of the player to mold the game experience to their own whims and in their own image, somehow detracts from the artistry there.
Mhm.
And I sort of get what Ebert was getting at, and I think I'm I'm kind of ambivalent about Ebert's position because on the one hand, frankly, I don't agree with like his conclusion that games can't be art for the same reasons that you said. I actually think that the interactivity inherent in the medium is something that gives it a unique kind of artistic potential, right?
Mhm.
A unique option for artistic engagement and places the player or the audience in a totally unique position that can be exploited artistically. But where I am kind of sympathetic to his argument is that a lot of the games that I see presented most often in arguments for like games can be art too are actually really shitty movies.
Yes. Yes.
You know,
Absolutely.
like it's like here's a stylish 2D platformer with very simple mechanics, and we've shoehorned on this really maudlin, like young adult fiction quality story about like war or something
Mhm.
onto it
Yeah.
with a lot where actually like the story beats in these instances are often prescripted
Mhm.
or and the moral choices presented are often like navigating a flow chart, right? They're not
Yeah.
any more complex than navigating a flow chart. It's like, do I want this guy to live or do I want him to die?
Mhm.
And some games, like I was playing The Witcher 3 not that long ago, and I got pretty frustrated with the way it presented moral choice,
Mhm.
honestly, because it really was just like okay, you can make two choices. Both of them are going to potentially have negative moral consequences. Like you're going to have to bear the weight of the decision you made either way. And I'm fine with that. I don't think it should be a clear cut, like good versus evil choice, because in life, often, like you're choosing in a state of like moral blindness.
Yeah.
But it was so clearly like make this decision and there might be unintended consequences, but the game was very much like wagging its finger. It'd like be like, okay, you're about to make an important moral choice. This next thing you do is going to be significant, so choose the right dialogue option.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know. I found it really kind of facile and superficial
Yeah.
and silly compared to what movies, what films from even like the early age of film, like films made within the first couple of decades of film as a medium were doing.
Yeah.
And often, like, the sad thing is that The Witcher is actually one of the better examples. And often, in
Mm-hmm.
fact, there's no choice at all. That it's actually like true young adult kind of bullshit where it's like, okay, your character's about to undergo some trauma. You don't have any choice about it.
Yep.
And don't worry, at the end, we're going to like provide you with a rationale and an explanation for this trauma, but prep yourself for, and it's very, these things are very, in my mind, like they're attempts to weakly imitate what other art forms are doing and what
Mm-hmm.
other art forms have done better. And I think actually you can get more robust, like moral and emotional experiences from games when you force the like scripted section of it into the background and foreground player choice, which is something like a game like Papers, Please does that,
Mm-hmm.
or another game that I played years and years ago. I think it's called Passing, and
Oh,
the
Passage, you mean?
I think maybe it's
Is it
Passage.
by
Yeah, it's essentially
Jason Rohrer or whatever his name was? Or
yes.
it's just funny because I was just about to bring that up, and that's such a weird game. It's so funny.
Where the game is essentially you move from the left side of the screen, and it's the aesthetic of a like old school arcade game. And over the course of the game, you can kind of like encounter a spouse and get married, and your score like moves up. And there's this sense of like progression here, but none of it is like, but it's contextualized very
Mm-hmm.
differently. And it actually like instead of trying to use games as a means to like imitate what film might be doing, it's a very, I think, pure way of contextualizing life through the lens of a game.
Yeah.
And I think by doing that, it, even in its simplicity, like it's way more like effective than something that would be like, okay, we're gonna shove a lot of ham-fisted like dramatic dialogue down your throat. That, by the way, is often I don't understand why this is the case,
Mm.
but video games are universally terribly written. I
Yeah.
don't know how this is because it like my day-to-day life every day we get multiple submissions at Misery Tourism from incredibly skilled writers whose technical skill is above and beyond anything I see in video games, and we're not a paying market,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
I don't understand why it's always the same like kind of slock,
Yeah.
that you end up with video game writing. But sorry, I feel like I derailed you though. I feel like you were about to say
No,
something.
no, that was exactly what I was talking about. No, that's fantastic. It's so funny you bring up Pass because I was literally just about to bring the developer that I don't know how to pronounce his name. I think it's Jason Rohrer, Jason Rohrer. I don't know. He has done a lot of fantastic work. Have you ever heard of the game Sleep is Death?
No, I haven't actually.
It's this game where it's a two-player game, and one person creates like a world. Like they have preset assets, or you can make pixel art things, and then one person plays a character, and then you take turns and you make a story together. And I just had some of the most like valuable experiences in my life with my friends. Although again, that feels like a weird example of a game as art because that's more like just a software or something where you make like you're creating things just in this kind of curated environment.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it does. It is a little bit closer to like an RPG system, right?
Hmm.
In that sense, but I mean, it's also not that distinct from like interactive art installations that you
Yeah.
might encounter at a museum or something. Performance art,
Hmm.
right? And I think that when games enter that space of performance art, it's actually pretty valuable because, and RPGs do this too, because that's actually an experience that's walled off to a lot of people. Like, I grew up in rural America. I've spent most of my life living in rural areas,
Hmm.
and so I haven't had many opportunities to like go to art museums. Like,
Yeah.
I remember the first time I set foot in the Hirshhorn Museum in DC. I was probably like 20 or something, and
Hmm.
it blew my fucking mind. I had no perception that this is like, had no way of anticipating what that space would be like. Like, I knew what kind of art I might encounter. I'd seen like abstract expressionist art before, and I'd seen all of this shit, but I had never been in that kind of space before.
Yeah.
And there's something really unique about that. And I think if games can provide people with that kind of experience remotely, if you can create a game like that, that's a sort of like collaborative performance art piece where the artist may just create a framework that the players can work inside, just like if somebody duct tapes themselves to a wall in an art museum and lets people come up and like tape signs to them or throw shit at them or whatever, it's a similar kind of experience, right?
Yeah.
The artist has created this thing and then surrendered this thing to the audience, and I think that's still art.
Hmm.
And I think that that gaming actually presents the opportunity, and I know I just said that, to make these kinds of experiences more broadly and widely available. And I think
Yeah.
that's fucking fantastic, you
Well,
know?
and like both broadly like available and also done on a scale that can be more fully fledged than something like a physical art installation, like in the way that something like Sleep is Death, you can create a whole universe in this thing that is like it could be a really unique expression compared to like the limitations when you're in a physical space and stuff like that. So yeah, I think that's a
Right.
great point. There are some games I wanted to bring up in response
Yeah.
to your specific critique of like modern games. I think in a weird way, The Last of Us, that game acts as a weird deconstruction of itself in its final moments. The first game, that is, where
Mm.
the whole game you're acting like this hero character who's doing the unambiguously morally right thing, finds some kind of escapism in acting out through this character, and then at the end you discover that spoilers for The Last of Us if anyone gives a shit, you have to sacrifice the one girl you've escorting the whole game in order to get this cure that will save humanity. And the main character says, fuck it, I'm going to kill all the scientists and not get this cure. And you have no choice. You just do it. And so now you are now broken from this escapism into this flawed, morally bankrupt choice because of this character motivation now. And it's a deconstruction of, because the whole game plays like a movie game. Like there's these very
Right.
like scripted cinematic sequences, which I always thought was interesting, but only to the extent where it talks about how its own approach doesn't work. And then I'm pretty sure I've heard it does interesting things in the sequel, which I haven't played, with regards to perspective and switching to the villain and stuff. But I still think that was a strong statement in that way.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I've never played The Last of Us. See, in my outside perspective on both of the games has mostly been framed by like the controversy around them, which I
Yeah.
think was kind of pretty silly
Oh
on
yeah.
both sides. And my broad perception of like what the game seemed to be about, and I think I kind of wrote it off because I got the impression that is like, oh, this is going to be like The Walking Dead or something,
Hmm.
which I think, which didn't really like. I thought it was going to be that kind of like facile approach to like moral choice, where
Yeah.
it's like simply it's nihilistic in the wrong way. Like coming where I'm coming from. Like if any of the people who read Misery Tourism end up listening to this, they're going to find it very strange that I would use like nihilistic as a pejorative,
Hmm.
but I do think like in The Walking Dead, it's this kind of grim, like march through bad moral choices with very little like either like serious reflection on what any of it means
Yeah.
or serious reflection on how any of this stuff would play out if these characters weren't simply walking plot devices, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
And yeah.
oh, sorry. If you want to, if you got something else you're going on there.
No.
Okay,
Sorry.
that was it's actually so great that you kind of segue into that because that was something I wanted to bring up. Where I think even in the one podcast I've heard you in, you discuss what you think misery tourism means and how you think it's kind of a ridiculous critique of something. Where it was in one of your write-ups where you talk about that. Like if you either say that it's glorifying kind of sadness or poverty or something like that, which many of these works are not, or it's I forget the other way you deconstruct it, but you basically say that there is no real critique directly on the work, and I totally agree. But I can see a type of misery tourism showing up in the way people engage with things like The Walking Dead or a film I've brought up every single podcast episode somehow, Hereditary. I think those are works that are really just roller coasters under the guise of something greater because of these pessimistic perspectives and its delusions of like greater moral complexity when in reality it's just blind pessimism as opposed to blind optimism, which I think are equally as uninteresting.
I absolutely agree with you. And I think when Rudy and I are going through submissions, right, or when we're working on our own work for misery tourism, one thing I do not want to see is a kind of like surface level, just like skimming across the surface of depravity, right?
Yeah.
Every once in a while, and I don't want to be like hard on anyone, but every once in a while we'll get a submission that kind of reads like fucking Dexter or something, right? Where it's like this kind of like very superficial like portrait of like a serial killer and like all the vicious terrible things they're doing or something like that, or it's just like just like complete submerging in like as much banal nastiness as possible.
Yeah.
And almost without fail, we don't end up accepting those pieces. The pieces that we do end up accepting have, I think, one or both of two things. Either they make a very real attempt to dig below that superficial surface and understand the psychology of human misery, whether that's the psychology of suffering or whether it's the psychology of sadism or masochism or the psychology of perversity, or there's a real attempt to grapple with the question of why people persistently behave in fucked up ways, right? Or there's humor, like there's a real there's satirical pieces, right?
Yeah.
And I think if that one or both of those things, either the insight or the humor, have to be present to make transgressive works really, really sing, really effective.
I mean, I think that kind of metric can almost apply to anything. You'll either be, if it's intelligent or entertaining. I mean, like that's it.
Right.
But I think especially though with works with more negative perspectives or transgressive subject matter, because that material will amp up any sort of response to it. It becomes much easier to exploit that stuff just for a simple thrill. And so I think rising above those base responses to that subject matter will result in something much more meaningful.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
I was even thinking with regards to humor, because that's something I wanted to bring up when you were making your first point, was that if you think of a work like American Psycho or even like Johnny the Homicidal Maniac, those works, I guess they do have something to say on some level, but I don't think they'd be as effective as they are without the elements of black comedy they use.
Yeah, absolutely. Because what the humor does, in I think those cases, is it reveals the superficiality of the psychopathic character, right? And I think that's fundamental because first of all, that's like as far as like abnormal psychology is concerned, that seems to be the case. It's not that the that individuals who are like who suffer from like full-fledged antisocial personality disorder are so deep and dark and troubled and have so much going on that they have to act out in violence. What's actually the case is there's so little there.
Yeah.
There's so little happening under the surface that there's nothing to stop them from behaving that crassly, right? And I
Mhm.
think that a lot of that it's smart to engage with that kind of subject matter in that way, and that when film, and once again, let's go like I think I was going to go back to Dexter, and I was going to hate on Dexter so bad, but I'll give Dexter just a little bit of credit.
Mhm.
Like in its early seasons, I think it did actually try to grapple with that sense of like this guy is paper thin and he's making this kind of uh, weak attempt to like grapple with the fact that he's just like he doesn't have these capacities that other people have. But I think as like it went on, and in order to like deal with the fact that like this wasn't a movie and this was like we just have to keep like generating content,
Yeah.
like there was an attempt to add depth and development to the character that I think every time they did it just fell flat,
Yeah.
right? Um, but yeah, like I do think it would be like unfair to give a character like that more humanity than they deserve, if that makes any sense, you
Mhm.
know?
Yeah, and I
Uh,
feel like both those ways of approaching it, either through a direct insight, like in a kind of empathetic way, or to introduce humor, are both kind of ways of breaking down the complexes that we're talking about. These kind of psychopathic, sociopathic complexes, where I think you can either, I think the first way is how you really communicate with anyone is through like, I understand you, this is how you can ascend it, or here's insight into how your complexes are wrong, or something like that, just like a basic form of communication. Or with something like humor, I think that's particularly effective in these cases because that's the opposite of how these people want to view themselves. Is that
yeah,
like
right.
the opposite of the super serious, disconnected view of the world is something so primal and unpretentious as laughter and like humor. That's a good way of breaking down the complexes and again getting through to them through a less direct way and in a way that maybe could resonate with others in an easier way, maybe.
Absolutely. And I think you can actually, um, I think you can tell a lot about a person by how they respond to satire and what they consider to be funny or unfunny.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you can tell a lot about society by the state of satire. And I think that right now, in American culture, like actual satirical humor is in a pretty bleak place.
Bro, SNL's killing it right now. I don't know what you're talking
Oh,
about.
but well, and I think that's I don't want to get too far on a tangent here, but you basically have shows and publications that seem to think satire is a restatement of their partisan priors, right? And this
Hmm.
is happening on the right and on the left,
Yeah.
right? This is just as true of the Babylon Bee, say, as it is of SNL. I
Mm.
don't want to say The Onion because The Onion is a more complex case where actually it was brilliant up until just a few short years ago, and where actually I think that like its current pretty pathetic state is more a result of the fact that it was bought out in like 2016 or something, and a large portion of the former staff of writers left and things like that. Like, I don't think it's simply, oh, media is so partisan now and it has to be like this unequivocal talking head kind of publication from one side or the other.
Mhm.
But I do think like you don't have many really sharp satirical voices right now. And I think the ones that you do have uh, come under like immense scrutiny. Like, look at Dave Chappelle, who is
Mm.
probably one of the few comedians who is still more interested, excuse me, in providing like really uncompromising short satire and chasing the joke down whatever avenues like it goes. And I think that he's kind of a man without a country,
Yeah.
you know.
Well, and I mean, like on the flip side, I would almost argue the same for Sam Hyde. I hope that that doesn't offend you or anything.
Oh no, it doesn't. I'm not super familiar with his work. I've always wanted to kind of look into it because he is this figure that is like viewed so acrimoniously by some people and
Hmm.
is so controversial that I'm like, I should really check his shit out just to like, because sometimes you'll dig into that and you'll be like, oh, people hate this person because they're a partisan, right?
Hmm.
And sometimes you'll dig into that, like with Dave Chappelle, and you'll be like, oh, people are pissed at him because he does not care who he offends, and he's just like chasing this thing down as ruthlessly as possible, you
Yeah.
know? But anyway, yeah, you were
Now
saying.
I want to check out Dave Chappelle because I've always been turned off because I thought because I just never checked out his stuff before and I thought he had that partisan perspective. But now that really interests me to check him out. And on the flip side, I would really recommend you check out at least $1 Million Extreme World Peace because to me that is. Like at least from my perspective, the last truly transgressive but with purpose and artistry show that I've seen on mainstream television.
Oh yeah, no, I'll have to check it out. I definitely will.
Yeah,
Um,
and yeah, like just the failure of like of comedy and satire to not move beyond pandering to preconception now is something really dire. And I think in a different way, I think humor and laughter being such a primal thing that we've somehow kind of managed to, at least in the mainstream, kind of disconnect from. So now people only laugh at stuff they intellectually or principally or whatever agree with, rather than
yeah,
something that's funny, is really scary. And I worry that the same trends exist in sexuality, another primal urge that
yeah.
like people can't get off because of their own insecurities now, where they have to manifest these things in really fucked up ways, which is another really freaky concept.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think you make a good point because both of those things, like sexuality and humor, serve as a kind of release, right?
Hmm.
And it serves, and both in different ways, serve as a means of diffusing conflict.
Yeah.
As weird as that
Yeah.
sounds,
Yeah.
right? Like if you look at groups of people through, like if you look at this from a very tribal perspective, right?
Hmm.
Let's say you have two tribes that feel immense hostility towards each other because they occupy adjacent territories.
Hmm.
Like, how do they arrive at integration? Like, how do they cease to be two discrete, hostile entities and become like one integrated whole where they don't want to fucking kill each other all the time? Well, either they intermarry, like they fuck their way out of the conflict,
Yeah.
or they laugh their way out of the conflict, you know. And I think this is something that's like misunderstood, badly misunderstood about humor right now, where there's a real sense of like trying to avoid offensive jokes and jokes that are that people think are derogatory in one way or another, when in actuality, like if you look at like the early industrial period, right, where you have where suddenly like African Americans who have migrated out of who have been freed from slavery and migrated to the cities, or coming into contact with Irish immigrants, or coming into contact with working class people who are like, you know, who can trace their lineage back to the Mayflower or whatever, and they're all working on the same fucking assembly lines, all working in the same factories. Like, that's where you start to see ethnic humor and like quote unquote racist humor kind of really, and things like even wild like shit like blackface, where that suddenly becomes popular. And yeah, that does serve on one level as a way to like denigrate the other. It does serve as like a tool for quote unquote white supremacy or whatever. But also that humor was serving as a tool of cultural exchange and of cultural like integration and acclimation, right?
Hmm.
Like you have a guy working with you who seems totally unfamiliar to you. You make a joke about how he's different from you, and he makes a joke about how you're different from him. And that eventually that's an ice breaking kind of thing, right? And that's
Hmm.
a tool that like leads to a more harmonious culture. And you see the same shit in like cultural appetites for like look at like black comedians like Dave Chappelle and Chris Rock,
Hmm.
who were able to break through and get huge white audiences. How did they do that? Did they do that by going the Bill Cosby route and just trying to be as inoffensive as possible? Were they afraid to like tell jokes about white people? No, like a third of their set is making fun of white people, right?
Hmm. Yeah.
And I'm laughing at that. I think their audiences who are in the case of like Chris Rock and Dave Chappelle, you're talking about audiences that are probably actually 50-50, unlike say Cosby, where it was like probably like 90% white people, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And how do you get like white people in the room being made fun of a black guy who's on the stage, who's in the position of like quote unquote quote like cultural power in that exchange? Like, how do you do that? You do that because the humor is sharp, the humor is that subversive, and because that laughter is actually, and because those offensive jokes are actually a tool of cultural integration, or actually a tool that bring us closer to the kind of harmonious interrelationship with people that we don't totally grok for one reason or another.
Yeah.
And I think the real problem right now is so much of that shit is taboo. Like you talk
Hmm.
about like sexual taboos, and even weird like attempts to return to like quote unquote like anti-miscegenation shit under the guise of progressivism. Like that's
Yeah.
wild to me. Like that's unbelievable when really like laughter and sexuality are these ways to bring disparate communities together and get them to interact in a like friendly and communal, if still kind of jockeying sort of way, and
Yeah.
I think without those outlets you end up with outlets that are purely resentment based, that are purely acrimonious, where it's just this positive feedback loop of growing and growing tension and growing ugliness, and I don't think that's particularly good for anyone.
Yeah, man, oh, that's so on point. I never even considered it that way. That is an amazing way to put how like even just like your basic example there of just like making jokes about how you're different is a way to help get past those and get the other. That's an amazing way to put it. And I think, I mean, to reduce it to a more absurd case, which was somehow a thing, the use of the phrase cultural appropriation and that whole thing of like my culture is not your prom dress and stuff like that. Like that's ridiculous. That's literally like enforcing division, segregation, and enforcing like going against commingling, which is exactly what these people I thought were supposed to be working towards is like a basic like human understanding of each other, which I think that's really fucked up and absurd. And I think in a way, of course, me coming from like this kind of anime background, even like the way we've tried to like reduce people down to like weebs and stuff, and like I think in a way there is this sort of weird exoticism to it that can be damaging and kind of surface level, and I think like taking it to extremes and not understanding different cultures is fucked up, and there are other ways around it, but still in a way like people's resistance to engage with things in other cultures because they don't want that sort of connotation to it is kind of fucked up. And I think the way you've mentioned that sexuality, in addition to humor, is a way of getting through these things. I mean, the rise of like hentai across America,
Yeah.
it's like it probably increased a lot of Japanese's cultural resonance there, and like they're coming in like through the back door, as it were. Like that's really crazy.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think it's telling that the desire to police culture, whether in the guise of like puritanical, like conservative evangelicalism, or
Mhm.
whether in the guise of like woke progressivism or whatever, like ultimately they always it always ends with attempts to police sexuality and to police humor,
Yeah.
and by extension to police art, which is usually which can't exist without those two things, right? Which is
Hmm.
usually deeply interconnected with those two things.
Yeah, and I think like especially like those two concepts of sexuality and humor are so important, and the reason they go for it is because they know it's the way to reach everyone through these primal human urges
Yeah.
of
Right.
like you said, relief, like both sexual and comedic. And yeah, that's an amazing way to put it. Damn, I don't know where to go from there. That was really good. What else can we? Anything else? Anything else in your mind lately? You got anything else to go on?
I'm trying to think. I think trying to think about if there's anything else like mystery tourism or that project or what we're. I kind of feel like I hit a lot of the like main points
Hmm.
that I wanted to about what we're trying to accomplish. Of course, we also have a weekly reading series, which you kind of alluded to, called Misery Loves Company, where different like the term I always use is like transgressive and outsider authors come and share their work. And it's funny, talking about terminology, I always have trouble. I feel like there's not an easy, simple word for what we do. I don't
Yeah.
really feel like there's a clear like cultural movement that we're a part of, or a clear like we can't really say like oh for a while like the idea was just like oh yeah you're punk, like just say you're punk, people will, will understand what that means or whatever. And I don't really, so I always end up going back to those two labels of like transgressive for the reasons I've already talked about, and then outsider because I want to position the work that we highlight in direct opposition to like institutional literature or institutional art,
Yeah.
and to works that are real, because I think at this moment like our artistic and cultural and political and social institutions are deeply and profoundly fucked.
Yeah.
And I don't want to be perceived as a function of those institutions,
Hmm.
you know? And I also, I'm not looking to try to promote and highlight artists who see misery tourism as one publication credit to go on their CV to pitch their book to a major publisher,
Yeah.
right? Because I've seen what the big publishers are putting out, and it fucking sucks. And I've seen the kind of culture that um big mainstream publishers and big mainstream publications are pushing, and it's sad, it's bleak. It's extremely bleak. It's one either of like profound content with a capital C superficiality,
Hmm.
you know, it's one of franchises, or it's one of cultural resentment and of trying to make hay off getting different people who don't have shit to hate each other.
Yeah.
You know? And neither of those like great cultural projects are of any fucking interest to me. And I
Hmm.
think or so it's great to find artists who are like, no, I want to be outside of this thing, you know, and I'm not afraid to have my name appear in a publication that some people think is transgressive or fucking offensive, right? Or
Yeah.
scary or disturbing or whatever.
Yeah.
You know, people who are willing to take that risk, who are willing to say, you know what, I'm not going to play the status climbing game, and I'm not going to view my art primarily as a commodity to be sold for fame or to be sold for like in some cases for fucking pennies,
Hmm.
right? Um, yeah, and I know that sounds like that when I hear myself saying that, it sounds fucking pretentious.
But that's the thing.
But really, like we just want to like have a place out there to publish the kind of shit that we really enjoy and that we don't see enough of out in the world. That's a better way to put it.
Yeah, no, and that's awesome. Well, I mean, like, in all you described there, like, I mean, really is the fundamental, like, principles of art is to put something out there that you want to see. And because the thing
Yeah.
is, like, the art's going to last forever. You're here for however many years, you know? Like, why do so many people spend so much time trying to make the art serve their ends when it's just very short sighted thinking, in
Yeah.
general, I think, which is why I, like, because I'm lucky. I managed to find a career that has nothing to do with art and still find ways to express myself, which is lucky. Which I know a lot of people do not have the luxury of. So I am sympathetic to an extent, but I think, I mean, obviously what you guys are doing is the best shit that you could be doing, and I'm very glad to have you on here to support it, because I want to support this stuff too. And I think,
Yeah, no, I do want to be clear. I am absolutely sympathetic to that as well, and I am absolutely 100% sympathetic to people who are hustling to get eyes on their
yeah,
work. I don't want people to perceive like, I don't want to be perceived as one of these guys who's like, well, just make good art, put it out there, and if the audience finds you, they find you, and if they don't, I'm sorry, buddy.
hmm,
Like, I do think that like the unfortunate reality is if you're an outsider artist of any kind, you have to fucking hustle. And on
yeah,
some level, you do have to be shameless, and you have to be, and you shouldn't be shamed for being shameless in that
hmm,
way.
yeah,
Like, and you shouldn't be shamed by the pretensions of people who have easy access to institutional tools,
yeah,
right? Like, I'll see people, like, especially people who are like operating inside the world of institutional lit, give lectures about how you should and shouldn't promote your work, and
hmm,
how you should and shouldn't advertise your art, and what you should and shouldn't do to get eyes on your piece, and who you should shut up and listen to. you
yeah,
know and that's all bunk.
yeah,
That's all bullshit. When you're outside the institutions, whether it's because you were born poor, or or you suffer from mental illness, or you just don't want to play that fucking game, or whatever, you have to do what you have to do to get eyes on your work. And if that means you're on a street corner, like shoving your mixtape under the eyes of people who don't want to see it because one person out of 30 might buy it,
hmm,
like, do it. And if that means you're on Twitter with a really weird fucking account, you know, photoshopping like Sonic into hentai, or whatever, do it. Like, if
yeah,
that's what's going to get eyes on your work, you do it. But what I have no interest in doing is comforting and coddling institutions that have no interest in my work and the work that I by others that I appreciate, the work of my friends, the work of artists who I respect and love. Like, I am not going to warp my approach to suck up to people who I think are like flushing art down the toilet to begin with anyway,
yeah,
because like growing an audience for misery tourism has been an absolute game of fits and starts, right? It's been a process of trying some shit, falling flat on my face, or trying some other shit, having it work a little bit and then stop working, trying something else. And I think that like if you're not working within the confines of institutions, if you can't network in a conventional way,
hmm,
that's absolutely what you have to do. Or if, like me, you're someone who's like carries around a lot of social anxiety, and like
yeah,
the idea of like going out in the world and promoting my work and the work of the authors that we publish by shaking hands and like going to parties and like trying to work my way into a position with one of the big publishing companies, going back to school and getting the right degree, attending the right parties while I'm at school, and so on and so forth until you get to that point. Like, that's terrifying.
yeah,
Like, it's fucking scary for me, to be completely frank. It's fucking scary for me to go to the grocery store. Like, I was in a
yeah,
conversation the
so,
other day.
yeah,
Someone was like, oh, well, like, you don't have many items. Why don't you just go to the self checkout? And I'm like, no, I can't do that because once I went to the self checkout and I couldn't complete the process properly, and one of the people had to come over and help me, and it ruined the experience for life. And just these little things, like, socialization is such a hilariously and like comically traumatic thing for me.
hmm,
And I think for a lot of other people, like, maybe not to the, like, I'm a kind of an extreme case, but for a lot of people, like, the will, the courage, the confidence to go out and relentlessly pimp your shit
Yeah.
in public through interactions with other people. Like, it's just not there. You
Yeah.
just don't have that. Like, we haven't succeeded. It's not like we're making money off the site. It's not like we had the kind of audience that a lot of like major publications have. But we have built a loyal audience. We have built a following behind the site, and we've done it in really like unconventional and weird ways. So like, if you feel like me and you have trouble like doing it the right way, the quote unquote right way, well, here's what we tried. Maybe this will be useful for you, you know?
Yeah, and I feel like, well, even the methods you propose are even a more modern way, because I feel like with, especially with COVID, like making everything a lot more online, remote, I feel like the methods you talk about will be much more valuable going forward and all that stuff, just in a practical sense. Another thing I wanted to say is you are doing exceptional for your social anxiety. I mean, you hosting that Misery Loves Company thing and expressing yourself and as earnestly as you are, you are doing fantastically in that way. So I just wanted to applaud you for that.
Thank you. It's easier. It's easier with the buffer of the internet,
Yeah.
right? Like, I mean, I think there's something about the physical presence, excuse me, of other human beings that is really oppressive to me.
Mm.
It's sharing space with other people. And I think it's because, I mean, I think it's a few things. Like, one of it is just like my anxiety level is really high, and you pick up on cues and stuff, and you become hypersensitive to like
Yeah.
personal space. Yeah, I'm not good at eye contact
Same.
because
Yeah.
I find eye contact really like powerfully intimidating. So I
Hmm.
and but I'm also hyper aware that I'm not good at eye contact, which creates a kind of like weird thing where like I'm like shit, like if I'm in an interview or something, I'm like shit, I better make eye is it time to make eye contact? Should I like
Because it's all these
you know, it's
unspoken rules. Like it's all like
right.
this game that all these people are playing. You're just like, is this how you play? Like it's fucked up.
And I think for me, I'm very much a verbal thinker, a verbal communicator, and I very much like not well in tune. I'm very bad at like spatial shit,
Mm.
whether it's spatial perception and I don't know if it's like if it's like Asperger's or just like some particularly unique form of autism that I have, but
Yeah.
I've got a lot of trouble with like spatial awareness. And so and especially if I get in like the zone verbally, like it's like the curtain goes down, you know?
Hmm.
And and it's a lot easier if I'm hosting a Zoom reading or something because I can be like, okay, I'm talking now. I need to think, okay, it's time to let them talk. It's time to let them read. Like there's a very distinct compartmentalization of like time and space and role that make it easier for me to feel comfortable,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah, well, that's the thing. Like I was saying before, it's like this is a game we now understand. You know, like with the defined order and logic that's not beholden to some sort of earned social awareness that you get through exposure or whatever the hell that makes you get. So I mean, I totally relate to all those things. And I think when we're talking about it in terms of promoting work, I think it's a real double-edged sword for people with that sort of awkwardness of it. I think it applies to both of us because we both lack this sort of meta awareness of the way to charm people and have this sort of in-person charisma that I think help people with that. And B, we're working with works that are not easily put into labels, do not easily appeal to preconception, and so that means if anything, we have to work. We have to have extra of those charms to convince people that we're not insane. And
Yeah, exactly. Or dangerous.
yeah, that's. I think that's why it's really a double-edged sword. And why stuff like you rang out there these other methods is just so important. And
I think in some ways, like I'm uniquely fortunate because I'm not an intimidating person.
yeah.
Like some people who have the same kind of hang-ups that I do, the same kind of social challenges that I do, and in the past, like I have, but their like natural knee-jerk way of handling it is to be like more confrontational, more rigid, and more like assertive.
Yeah.
And I think that can be a little dangerous and unfortunate especially when you're dealing with work that people already want to stigmatize, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Whereas like my natural posture is just happens to be one of fear and one of like a lack of confidence, right? So like I'm often like if I'm going to overcorrect, I'm going to try to overcorrect, and this is something I've had to teach myself too, is like overcorrect towards humility, don't overcorrect towards confidence, right?
Yeah.
Over make yourself small. If you feel uncomfortable in a situation, make yourself small. You're not going to win, but you're also not going to escalate it. And also like when you're kind of a small guy too, like it'd probably be a very different situation if if I was physically imposing or something. So I happen to be like not physically imposing and not particularly like emotionally imposing, and I think that it's given me a way to like diffuse some of what can come from voicing an opinion that's maybe transgressive or controversial, or sharing art that's transgressive or controversial.
Yeah.
And I mean, it is true that certain communities or whatever are more primed to find a space for this kind of work.
Hmm.
Because Rudy and I never really did find an outlet within the tabletop RPG world, within
Yeah.
the indie RPG world. I mean, eventually we developed an audience by broadening our scope. And what I found is lit people, and film people, people who are into the arts that have like a longer history. Maybe just because there's more people out there, more people are interested in literature and film and so forth, or because there is like a greater, more robust history of transgressive works and experimental works in those mediums. But it's a lot easier to find people who are down with transgressive literature and then pitch them on your games like, hey, we also make games, than it is to find people are into tabletop games and then pitch the content.
Yeah, yeah, man. I mean, I guess I'm kind of luck out there because I think, specifically tabletop games, like that's, I think with the vast majority of them, they're communal experiences. Like you need at least a few people to play them. Which I mean, you might be like a certain person might be minded in that way, but a whole group of people you can get together and play this thing will be minded in that way. So you're not getting the full experience and stuff. So that's why like I feel really bad for you because luckily with my thing, I just send it to them and they can watch it or not. I mean, it still functions the same way a film does. It just exists in a medium with preconceptions about how it operates. Yeah.
Right, right.
I don't want to keep like taking this back to AMB and stuff. I find it fascinating where I found someone who was interested in a niche subculture and trying to transcend something there, which is like the most thankless and like difficult job ever. I mean, I'm not trying to like suck your
No,
dicks right now, but it is really hard.
uh, it is. It's hard, it's challenging, and it's also in some ways hard to do it on the internet.
Yeah.
As much as I think I've mostly come presented myself like up to this point as like being pretty optimistic and positive on the potential of the internet, and that's because on the whole I am.
Hmm.
Because I don't think I would have found any audience for my work or any audience for misery tourism at all if I was fucking printing zines in my garage and handing them out on a street corner somewhere. Like the internet presented me with opportunities that if
Hmm.
I had been the same person born in a different place at a different time, I would have been shit out of luck.
Yeah.
But the internet also does breed a kind of like intellectual rigidity, right?
Yeah.
Like there's a lot. It's very easy with the internet to see ideology without seeing humanity and to reduce people to ideology and to eliminate their humanity, which I think is just about the most like vile and worthless thing you can do, especially if you're interested in art.
Hmm.
Like where they're really like placing ideology on a pedestal or making ideology like the centerpiece of your analysis or your appreciation is actually the act of stripping away everything of value in a work of art, because everything of value in art is in the nuance of the expression and in the ambiguity of the ideas that are being presented, in the complexity,
Yeah.
right? And to reduce that to ideology is to reduce it to propaganda, is to render it worthless. And
Yeah.
I think, unfortunately, like, the internet has a way, especially, I shouldn't say the internet, Web 2.0, post social media internet, has a way of reducing people to their ideological priors, to ideology. And I think that's the great, like, cultural toilet of our generation. I don't know what word to use.
Yeah.
Like the fertilizer lagoon of our generation is like just to be drowning in ideology all the time and to not be able to find joy,
Yeah.
whether that's in art or elsewhere, whether it's in art or in humor or in sexuality or in whatever, like to have everything reduced to ideology.
Yeah, and it's the most fucked up to do that in a cultural and an art context, because literally the base purpose of art is to explore different perspectives and to see how other people think, and to be so reductive as to bring it to ideology is literally to be like, oh, I appreciate paintings but only when they use this specific shade of gray or something. Like, it's like you've now limited the whole potential of the medium down to things you agree with, which is a very limited scope. So yeah, that's a great way to put it. And another thing I wanted to bring up was, I think something important about the internet too is that I feel like in some way you could have had a potential to cultivate a following if you were just putting misery tourism out of your garage. Because I think of like the case of like Daniel Johnston, like Daniel
Yeah,
Johnston
yeah.
was able to cultivate this really loyal following in Austin because like he would just go out and hand his shit out, and then people like you'd only have so many records. You're like, oh, I got a free cassette, now I don't have to go buy one, I'll go listen to this. But now it's like if Daniel Johnston had a fucking SoundCloud, who the fuck would know Daniel Johnston?
Yeah,
It's
because
just
there'd be a
another guy.
million Daniel Johnstons.
Yeah, so I
Yeah.
think like that localization and that appreciation for the local scene, which in turn are artists you are more like able to support and more likely to support and all that, that has been kind of lost through the internet. Even though I have a feeling there has been attempts made with trying to support local content, but it's been futile because you have the entire world at your grasp, which is like you said, like both a blessing and a curse. Um,
That's a really fucking excellent point. And actually, like, it really underscores one thing that, like, I discovered while working on Misery Tourism, and I think I mentioned this in the Substack post too, is like the value of cultivating a community.
mhm.
Like, when we decided to do the weekly readings, something profoundly changed. Like, something changed in my appreciation for what we were doing, because that was the moment, like, we sort of ceased to be just a publication, just a place for people to submit their work and then be published. And I think started to work on, like, on community cultivation. And I don't want to put this, like, I don't want to pretend this is like something that like I did alone or something, because it's not. It's like been this whole movement that involves many different presses within the community and
Mhm.
many different publications like Expat Press, Surfaces, and so on. Like, I'm like, who do I need to shout out here? Who would get offended if I didn't shout them out? Like, it's this whole thing where, like, the weekly reading series is one part of that, one outlet that helps to build that sense of greater community, right?
Mhm.
One more thing that helps to replace, like, what's missing, where, like, we can't find common geography, right?
Mhm.
So we've got to create a common space somehow, and we have to cultivate that space somehow, because it can't just be people passively retweeting each other's work on social media, or
Yeah.
people passively sniping at their perceived artistic enemies on social media,
Mhm.
because that's a fucking dead end. That's joyless. Um, there has to be some kind of attempt to have a community of artists, whatever that can look like in 2021 under our bizarre and unique conditions.
Mhm. Yeah, no, that's a really good way to put it, and I hope like that in some way we'll be able to rebuild those sort of spaces through maybe the rise of, I don't know, Discord servers and stuff like that. And I feel like maybe that's something that has always existed, is that the conscious people will find ways to gravitate and work with each other through whatever means possible.
Yeah, hopefully. I mean, I've actually been you know, after years of having very little response to the work that Rudy and I did, or having like pretty muted response, having like a small success here, a small success there, but always feeling very isolated and very alone in the work we were doing, being a part of finding ourselves like suddenly as a part of a community is wild, and it's gratifying in a way that I didn't even imagine was possible, you know?
Hmm. Yeah. No, and that's great. And um, I think in a weird way, I feel that at least with the stuff I've done through posting things and getting no response, I don't know how it helps or hinders your perspective, because I feel like it helps in the sense that you can't be basing your future work off that kind of dopamine rush of getting a response. You know, like
Yeah.
if you like pop off on your first work and you'll be like, oh, you're chasing that high. So in a way, it's helpful there because that helps you get in your own head, but it can be demotivating. I mean, so I guess it's a give and take there.
Yeah, oh, it absolutely is. I mean, I don't know. I'm an existentialist at heart. I'm always
Mm.
going to go back to that question of like, is there value in that suffering? And I don't think it's a resolved question. I don't think it's a question that I can offer any honest answer to. Like, what's the value of struggling in obscurity, and even what's the value of getting that attention, of getting that dopamine hit? I don't know. I mean,
Yeah, and I mean,
I
again,
think,
like
yeah.
art's forever. If you're making good stuff, I mean, hopefully somewhere down the line someone finds it. You know, so.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I think it's not like a binary thing
Mm.
either. That's something that I've come to realize. I think like a lot of the way like artistic endeavors are presented in the popular culture and in like just the way like our like sick society programs people to think about things, it's very much like, was this enterprise a success or was it a failure? You know, did you like manage to make some kind of breakout work that's being appreciated by tens of thousands or millions of people, or did you, or was it just fucking crickets? And in reality, it's often far more ambiguous and incremental about that, and your relationship to the art is often far more ambivalent. You know,
Mm-hmm.
um, where you create something and where you can create something one day and get no fucking response, and then the next day create something and suddenly 100 people view it, and then after that it can grow incrementally, and then it can go off a cliff, and you can, you know, and it can rise again. It's just very, and I think especially today, I think it's particularly worthless to think in binary terms of success and failure, especially with art.
Yeah, yeah, no, for sure. I mean, like again, like in terms of it being like uncertain, and it's just so circumstantial. You know, it's just like I, I think, I think to me, like I've just kind of, 'cause I spent a lot of time thinking about that stuff too, and it really just at the end of the day, it's like if you're compelled to do something, if you feel it in your gut to just go for something, just go for it. And if you no longer feel that compulsion for something you once did, try other stuff for a while, or you know, to
Right.
find new
Oh,
compulsions. Which I mean, it sounds so simple to just say that, but I that's just kind of how I direct myself at this time, where it's just like, oh, I want to do this, well, I'll just do it, you know, and I won't have these preconceptions about what I am or whatever, you know.
absolutely, absolutely. And you know, that's something that I've struggled with, like for basically my entire life. Like, so often I'll have an idea and I'll be like, and I'll belabor the idea to death to the point that I don't want to engage with it anymore. Um, and getting past like that tension, getting past that like fear of the page or fear of creating the thing and just fucking making it. Like there is so much to be said for that, and just letting like your weird, as you said, compulsions or whims or whatever take control, and giving yourself permission to do that like is incredibly valuable, because I look back now at things, and the things that I just wrote, you know, the things that I just sat down and just created, I'm often like, yeah, you know, I'll think afterwards, oh, that must be shit. I don't even want to look at it. And then I'll go back and I'll look at it and I'll be like, oh, actually, I still like that a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And then the things that were an agonizing process where I struggled and struggled to try to get exactly the right tone, find exactly the right words to express myself in exactly the right way, or in the way that I thought at the time, like a hypothetical reader would want it to be expressed. That stuff is shit. Like I look at that now and I'm like, oh, I fucking hate this. And it's amazing because you would think you have this that like the more you agonize over something, the better it's going to be. But often that's not the case.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that also does play into like expectations too. Like like you think like I suffered so hard for this, and then you have this really high expectation of it, and then it falls flat at this sort of video. Like I've had that 1,000 times, and then like they just toss off stuff that's just like, hey, that's pretty good. And I feel like maybe in a way that the toss off stuff is almost like kind of a removal of agency, where it's just letting these things organically flow. Which at least for me, I'm much more comfortable in the position of the curator rather than the sole creator.
Yeah, yeah.
Where it's
Right.
like, I mean, like I think that's what the beauty of remix culture is. It's like you can mesh things, these sensibilities, and make something new, but it's not necessarily you. Although you had the sensitivity of these things to bring them together.
Absolutely. And you can experience the same kind of liberation if you're like hemmed in by form or something. Like, for example, for a while I was playing around with like procedural text writing, like where I get like downloaded like a predictive text, excuse me, like a predictive text engine and feed like a certain variety of text into it, and then it like algorithmically generates like a set of options, and you go word by word that way
Mm-hmm.
and see what happens when you go down that path.
Yeah.
And often that was like it didn't necessarily produce the best work, but it was often like artistically liberating in a
Mm-hmm.
way.
Yeah.
um and the same thing with like designing work for contests or based on prompts or something. Like sometimes I'll just get hit with shit. Like it kind of strips away that sense of like you can sometimes get really bound up in like what's my greater project and how
Yeah.
does the next thing I want to create relate to my greater project, whatever that is. Whereas if somebody's like, okay, here's a one sentence prompt, create work based on this, it's like liberating. It's like, well, the project goes out the window. The holistic sense of who you are as an artist or whatever goes out the fucking window, and you're just making a thing based on another thing,
Yeah.
and it's liberating.
Yeah, well, like absolutely, and that's probably. I mean, that's almost definitely why I was drawn to AMVs so much. You have a song, you have a certain anime or work or whatever, and it's just making these things gel. Like you have this really like rigid framework and stuff, and yeah, like that's really like because that's when you almost become less the role of like an artist per se, where like you're working on this insight, you're probing into yourself and trying to preserve a unique perspective. In this way, you're almost kind of spinning that so that you now become a problem solver, like in the same way like an engineer does something, or like you have you have XYZ and you have to do XYZ, and now you got to make these pieces fit. And that's
Yeah.
and that's just a very primally satisfying thing, I think, because it's just a very like you do something, you get result, and it's just a beautiful thing out of hard work.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
No, constraints in art are a wonderful thing. They
Hmm.
really are. Like, people, I think, have a tendency to view like, and even I sometimes fall into this trap of like art as being best when it's like liberated and free from all constraints. But actually, like, nothing is a better inspirational tool than a self-imposed constraint. Like,
Hmm.
I'm very actually opposed to externally imposed constraints, like somebody being like, okay, well, like all poems should follow this rhyme scheme and meter, or is
Yeah.
it like
Yeah.
silly shit like that? But self-imposed constraints can be incredibly valuable, you
Hmm.
know.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, like, just the other thing that obviously comes to mind is like I heard like Brian Eno had these cards that just had random challenges on them. So when he was stuck in the recording studio, you would do something like just crazy, like you know. Use the microphone this weird way. I don't know what he fucking wrote on them exactly, but like I just think like, oh, that's a really creative way to be able to get yourself out of those funks and stuff. And like, and you think about, I mean, like obviously something like close to home for me is like the final episodes of Evangelion, where Hideaki Anno like people say it was because he didn't have a budget, but I'm not even entirely sure if that's fully the case, because he did similar experiments in other things where he would just like reduce certain scenes to just single drawings or sketches, and to try and express himself that way through these external things, which I think really brought to life the whatever he was trying to express there.
Yeah, absolutely. Or look at like abstract expressionism, right? I have all of these arguments with people like who with friends of mine who are like, even some friends who are artists, who are like, well, the old like cliche, like my child could have drawn that, or like,
Yeah.
well, where's the skill or the talent in that? And I'm like, no, like, don't you see, like, it's stripping by detaching art from representation, you're able to appreciate the art most purely, right?
Yeah.
The only thing, when you look at a Rothko, the only thing on the canvas is the emotion that Rothko wanted to evoke in the viewer, right?
Yeah.
It's, you have the purest, you're looking at nothing but paint and canvas, you're looking at nothing but color, and yet you experience emotion. And that is like, that's fucking it for
Yeah.
art, right? To be able to produce the most uncomplicated thing, totally detached from like nostalgia, right? Like, you can look at a beautiful landscape painting and appreciate it because it reminds you of something you saw once while you were in the past, in the back seat of the car as a
Yeah.
child going on a road trip or something.
Hmm.
And okay, like it, and don't get me wrong, like a great deal of technical skill went into reproducing that kind of landscape and creating a landscape that evokes that feeling from you.
Hmm.
But the artist is still kind of using a crutch there because they know most people have had some kind of experience like this at some point in their lives where they looked at a landscape and felt wistful, and they're channeling that. If you look at a Rothko and you feel sad, like it's not because it reminds you of your dead grandmother or something. It's because using just the basest, most simple tools available to the artist, using nothing but the medium itself, he managed, and not your nostalgia, not your memory, not your fantasies or whatever. He managed to evoke sadness or excitement or joy or wonder in you. And that is fucking incredible. Like, that's mind blowing to
Yeah.
me.
Yeah. That's a really powerful point. Like I never even thought to put it like that, like about just like the pure elements detached from everything. That's what abstraction is. You've abstracted these elements and made them the purest expression of these things. And it's funny because that was always something I'd associated with. I mean, a phrase I knew nothing about because I don't know shit about like actual like academic terms, but I was always a champion of what I thought was primitivism, which I always thought meant just like using these primal tools abstracted from preconception and using them to preserve an insight into these things without exploitation of the audience. And I've discovered that political primitivism, which is how the phrase I think tends to commonly be used, is a totally different thing, which I don't agree with at all.
No, I have. No, I agree with you, like, on like
Yeah.
artistic primitivism as an exercise, definitely. And I agree with you about political primitivism, which is like, no, I don't want to die of tuberculosis.
Yeah.
I don't really want to. If I had to think too much about where my food came from, I would probably die of starvation. I do not. I don't want. I can't see, like, technology. Now, granted, let me be clear here. Like, the economy as it exists now is deeply unequal and fucked.
Mhm.
But technology has liberated so many of us from like the awful, vicious, primal, degrading labor of day to day. And I don't think anyone, like, I grew up like in a working class family in a very poor rural area.
Mm.
I grew up struggling, and I grew up around people who were struggling even worse than I was. And I've seen subsistence farming. I've seen people live from subsistence farming.
Mhm.
It's terrifying. It fucking sucks. endlessly, horrifyingly degrading. And I've also like had the pleasure of like being able to feed my cat like meat from an animal that he'd never be able to catch in the wild, you know?
Yeah.
Of being able to like, you know, feed my cat a piece of stew beef or something. And I know for a fact that my cat, like simple, basic organism that he is, would never choose to go back outside, like to be scrounging around and trying to catch rodents or whatever, to be trying to worry about predators.
Yeah.
He doesn't even want to go outside. You know, he doesn't even, and I don't, he's not an out, he's strictly an indoor cat, but he like, strangers come over and he hides under the bed. Like, he wants to be fed, he comes over and he begs. And I am 100% confident that his quality of living is greater than 99% of all like felines that have ever lived, you
Yeah.
know? And I am equally confident that my quality of living, even though I'm not rich, I've never been rich, like even is still where I am in the first world with the benefit of modern technology is greater than 99% of all humans who have ever lived. And that, like, my clinical depression, my suicidal ideation, and my struggles with employment at different points in my life, and all these things, like, absolute are small fucking potatoes compared to the privation and horror that most humans have experienced throughout history, you know?
Yeah. And I was seeing like even just beyond like a survival level, it's just I think like we're both of the kind of type of people where our satisfaction comes from intellectual and cultural and like maybe emotional on some level stimulation. You know, like we like to think about things. We like to express these things, and this is what gives our life purpose. So I just think that in those older types of societies where like obviously like more primitive, where you have to a great deal of your time is devoted to basic living necessities. You don't have time for these pleasures and stuff. Not even pleasures, like purposes. Like this is work, and this is a type of work that is in addition to physical feats. And I just don't think there's as much of a place for people like us in those sort of societies, even though I think it's a totally valid passion and way of existence.
No, I mean, I'm not going to knock anyone who wants to go and own a small farm or something. I
Yeah.
mean, that's what my dad wanted to do, which is part of the reason why we moved out into this area. And my sister is very much she's a biology professor, but like her hobby, like she wants to go out hiking and camping, and she wants to like learn all this living off the land stuff. And if that's something you want to do, wonderful,
Mhm.
beautiful. Like, but that's just another like rare pleasure that comes from living in such an incredibly privileged moment in history, right?
Yeah.
But I have no romantic notions about it. If I was born 3 generations earlier, maybe 2 generations earlier than I was, I would have died.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh,
Like
I agree.
I would have killed myself,
Same.
or I would have been died by because like out of like my sheer incapacity to care for myself,
Yeah.
I'd be dead. I'd
Yeah.
be dead for one reason or another. And if I was born a couple of generations before that, I would have died in infancy or childhood or something like, you know, it's unbelievable. It is. I try to never lose sight, as funny as this would sound coming from me, knowing given the art that I create, you know, and the site that I run, I try not to lose sight of just how lucky I am to be born in this moment and to have access to technology and the fucking internet, where where a complete fucking weirdo like me can not only find a few people to talk to who share my interests and my passions, but who can actually, where I can actually cultivate an audience for my work. Now, granted, not an audience where like I'm making bank off it or anything, but
Yeah.
who fucking cares? Like,
Yeah.
at no other moment in history would someone like me, with my mix of weird tastes and obsessions and pathologies and anxieties and fears, be able to say that they've created an audience for their work, be able to say that they cultivated an audience, that they found a community of artists. I think, unless they were really fucking lucky and happened to be born like an aristocrat, like at the right moment. If you look at like most of like the romantic poets or the people who are writing like the the artists that have survived from the 17th and 18th century, these are all pretty much without exception aristocrats.
Yeah.
We're still living worse fucking lives than we are, frankly, who still often died at 35 of like an ingrown toenail or something,
Yeah. Yeah. Man, that's like to be like to remain cognizant of that and stuff, like, man, that's so important. Yeah, like I totally agree. Like, I mean, I relate to all the sentiments you expressed in terms of like being born in this moment is very important, and here and now, that's where we gotta be,
Yeah, yeah. Hey, we might live to see the singularity, which
Hell yeah. Hell, we might live to see where I could just like bodysuit myself into anime and go live there the rest of my existence, and I'm so there for that.
yeah.
So I guess we can start wrapping it up if you ain't got anything else to talk about. Have you got anything to plug right now? Anything you got going on? You wanna?
Yeah. At the moment, really just I guess just two things. One, miserytourism.com, which is the website I've been talking about, and two, my Substack, which I'm still trying to find a vision for, which I'm still kind of toiling away at, but that's Beyond Heat Death Substack. Or if you okay, now I'll plug the social media shit.
Yeah.
For Misery Tourism, it's at Misery Tourism, and my personal Twitter is at WH Duryea. That's WHDURYEA. And if you follow either of those Twitter accounts, you can find the website and the Substack, the weekly readings, and all that shit. And maybe future projects down the road. There's something that I've been kicking around that it's too early to talk about, but there may be another project coming in the not too distant future.
That's the hype, man. Oh, that's so good.
Yeah.
Any parting words? It's finally been
No, thank you so much. This has been so much fucking fun. Thank you so much for having me. I look forward to